Springfield, Illinois, May 12, 2003. It was an ordinary Monday in Springfield, Illinois, a city that, for many, represented the typical American dream. Houses lined up in quiet neighborhoods, well-kept streets, and a close-knit community where everyone knew each other by name. People lived their lives without any major surprises, and crime was something that was rarely part of dinner table conversations. But on that night of May 12, 2003, something terrifying was about to change the history of that peaceful town forever. At the center of this tragedy was the Thompson family. Michael Thompson, a man respected by all, was known for his hard work as manager of a local warehouse. He and his wife, Susan, of 42 years, had been married for more than 2 decades. To their neighbors and friends, they were the perfect couple, the typical family that represented the stability and success of suburban America. Together they had a daughter, Emma, age 19, who had recently entered the local college and was dating Jake Mitchell, a 23-year-old man who worked as a mechanic in his uncle's workshop. But like every facade of perfection, there were cracks that outside eyes could not perceive. Over the past few months, there has been growing tension within the Thompson household. Susan seemed distant, often pensive, and Michael, always busy with work, didn't notice the subtle changes in his wife's behavior. Emma, in turn, was at a stage in her life where studies and her relationship with Jake consumed most of her time, leaving little room to realize what was really happening around her. On that fateful night in May, the routine was the same. Michael had arrived late from work, tired, and Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner, as she always did. Emma was in her room, studying for an important test, and Jake had shown up to keep her company. It was an ordinary scene, a house where, at first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But while Michael ate dinner alone in the dining room, Susan and Jake exchanged glances in the kitchen, glances that carried a secret no one could ever imagine. The relationship between Susan and Jake began unexpectedly, just a few weeks before that night. What was initially a casual friendship, developed through Jake's frequent visits to the Thompson home, soon turned into something more. Jake, with his youthful, carefree charm, awakened feelings in Susan that she had long buried in her routine marriage. At the same time, Susan offered Jake something he didn't find with Emma, a mature, secretive, and forbidden connection, something that further increased the fascination between them. The first exchanges of messages began as innocent jokes. "Are you well?" turned into, "I miss you." And soon the quick, innocent encounters turned into something more intense. They both knew they were crossing a dangerous line, but it seemed impossible to stop. The risk, the danger, only increased the attraction between them. Each hidden encounter brought with it a feeling of adrenaline that both could not resist. That Monday, however, things were about to get out of control. Michael, tired and inattentive, barely noticed what was happening around him. For him, this was just another ordinary night, where he would eat in silence, watch the news and go to bed, as he always did. But what he didn't know was that, in that very house, a deadly secret was being built. While Susan and Jake exchanged glances and subtle smiles in the kitchen, Emma, on the other side of the house, still had no idea what was unfolding before her eyes. She trusted Jake, saw in him someone she could build a future with, and never imagined that her own mother would be the person who would betray her in the most brutal way possible. What began that night, with furtive glances and a brief touching of hands in the kitchen, would soon turn into one of the greatest scandals and tragedies Springfield had ever witnessed. No one in that house knew that their fate was already sealed, and that the days of calm and apparent normality were numbered. The secret romance that Susan and Jake were nurturing would soon explode into violence, dark revelations, and, eventually, a murder that would rock the town forever. What Springfield didn't yet know is that, sometimes, the greatest horrors come from the most unexpected places, within the quietest homes and most ordinary families. The Thompsons' tragedy was just beginning, and the unfolding of events that would come over the next few weeks would be so devastating that, years later, people would still remember that family as an example of how desire, betrayal, and hatred can destroy lives. On that night of May 12, 2003, the city of Springfield was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the fact that the biggest nightmare in its history was about to begin. Summer arrived early in Springfield, bringing with it intense heat and long days. Families were enjoying the sun and vacations, but inside the Thompson home, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The secret that Susan and Jake kept had turned the house into a minefield, where any false step could trigger an explosion. After their furtive rendezvous that May night, Susan and Jake became increasingly bold. The summer heat seemed to reflect the intensity of the affair they were keeping hidden from Michael and Emma. While their daughter was busy with her studies and part-time work, Susan and Jake took advantage of every opportunity they had to get together. The romance between them, which began as something exciting and forbidden, now consumed them in an overwhelming way. In the early months of the affair, they met in discreet places. The parking lot of an out-of-the-way supermarket, cheap motel rooms, or even the Thompson house when Michael was at work and Emma was at college. Susan felt more alive than ever, something she hadn't felt since the early years of her marriage. Each meeting with Jake was an escape from her routine life, an escape valve that took her away from the responsibilities of a wife and mother. Jake, on the other hand, was equally involved. He couldn't deny the fascination Susan held over him. Unlike girls her age, Susan was mature, self-assured, and had life experience that he found attractive. At the same time, he knew he was playing with fire. Dating Emma, Susan's daughter, he understood that it could end very badly, but the risk only made everything more exciting. The summer of 2003 progressed, and, with it, the affair between Susan and Jake intensified. They communicated constantly via text messages, exchanged secret phone calls, and always found ways to be alone. Jake started avoiding Emma, making excuses not to spend as much time with her. Emma, in turn, noticed that something was strange, but never suspected that the reason for Jake's coldness was linked to his own mother. One day in late July, Susan and Jake met in Springfield City Park, a place that was usually full of children and families, but that day was strangely empty. They walked together along a secluded trail, away from prying eyes. The sun was high in the sky, but the tension between them was even higher. Susan nervously asked Jake what they would do if someone found out about the affair. Until then, they had both treated it as something temporary, a secret that would eventually disappear. But at that moment, in the sweltering summer heat, fear began to set in. Jake, trying to hide his own anxiety, told Susan not to worry. "No one will find out," he insisted, "as long as we're careful." But the truth is that they were taking too many risks. Susan's behavior began to raise suspicions. Michael, who had initially been too busy with work to notice the changes, now noticed that something was different about his wife. She was more distracted, more distant, and sometimes even nervous when answering simple questions. When he confronted her, Susan would deflect the conversation, always relying on the excuse that it was just the stress of home life and worrying about Emma. The relationship between mother and daughter also began to fray. Emma, who had always been close to Susan, now noticed an invisible barrier between them. Whenever she tried to talk to her mother, she felt like Susan was distant, like her head was somewhere else. Emma began to get frustrated, but never at any point suspected the truth. To her, Jake was just a distant boyfriend and her mother was just dealing with her own worries. Jake, in turn, began to feel the weight of guilt. Although he wasn't in love with Emma, he knew he was hurting her by betraying her trust. However, the bond with Susan was too strong to break. Every time he thought about ending the affair, he found himself drawn back to her, like a moth flying towards a flame. The texts between Susan and Jake began to intensify, and they became more careless. Susan, eager to see Jake, began leaving her cell phone unlocked, something she would never have done before. It was one of those oversights that almost revealed everything. One afternoon, while Emma was at home studying, Susan's phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Emma, without thinking much, took her mother's cell phone to give it to her, but before she could call Susan, the screen lit up with a message from Jake. "I can't wait to see you again. Tonight?" Emma felt her stomach drop. She knew Jake's number well, and the message left her confused. Why would Jake be sending something like that to his mother? For a moment, she thought maybe it was just a joke, or a misunderstanding, but discomfort began to grow inside her. She didn't mention anything that night, but the discomfort would follow her for the next few days, like a constant shadow. The forbidden secret was about to be discovered, and none of them were prepared for the devastating consequences that would follow. The summer continued, but the tension within the Thompson household increased every day. The cracks in Susan's relationship with her daughter and her husband were becoming more apparent, and although they tried to keep up appearances, everyone knew something was wrong. The affair between Susan and Jake, which was once exciting and dangerous, was now becoming a time bomb, and no one knew when it would explode. Summer was coming to an end, but the heat was still in the air, as was the tension inside the Thompson home. Michael began to notice the changes in his wife more intensely. Susan was increasingly distant, and her excuses for going out and long silences were becoming more frequent and less convincing. Emma also felt the weight of this separation, but her mind was still occupied with Jake's recent strange actions. That morning of August 15th, everything seemed normal. Michael left for work as usual, and Emma was getting ready to spend the day at the college library. Susan, however, was restless. Guilt and fear were beginning to weigh more than the desire that drove her to meet Jake. She knew they were taking too much risk and that the rope was stretched to the maximum. But what she didn't know was that day, the rope would finally break. Emma was about to leave when Susan's phone vibrated on the kitchen table. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it caught Emma's attention, who was putting her books in her backpack. Jake's name flashed on the screen, and something inside her said she needed to see that message. It was the same feeling she had weeks before, when she saw the first suspicious message. Her heart quickened, and for a moment, she hesitated. But curiosity and the need for answers spoke louder. She took her mother's phone and swiped her finger across the screen. The message was short, but full of intentions. "I'll meet you at our place. 2 p.m. I can't wait." Emma stood frozen. Everything started to make sense in a painful and cruel way. Jake's distance, her mother's strange behaviors, the mysterious departures. It all fit together into a horrible puzzle that she never wanted to put together. Jake, the boyfriend she trusted, was having an affair with his own mother. The ground seemed to collapse beneath her feet, and for a moment, Emma didn't know what to do. She wanted to scream, to confront them both, but at the same time, a part of her couldn't believe it. He needed proof, something to confirm what his eyes were seeing. With shaking hands, she put the phone back where it was and, heartbroken, decided that she would follow Susan that afternoon. The next few hours passed in a blur. Emma couldn't think of anything else. She pretended to be leaving for college, but in fact hid in the back garden, where she could watch her mother leave. When Susan finally left the house at around 1:30 p.m., Emma followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear the sound in her ears. Susan drove to a remote motel on the outskirts of town, a discreet place, away from known eyes. Emma parked the car across the street, watching with bated breath as her mother walked into room number 7 without hesitation. The pain and anger Emma felt was almost unbearable, but she needed to see more, needed to know for sure. Minutes later, Jake arrived, and upon seeing him enter the same room, the truth was confirmed in a devastating way. Emma stayed there, in the car, for almost an hour, trying to process what she had just seen. His mind was filled with chaotic thoughts. How could they do this? How could her mother, someone she had always admired and trusted, betray her like this? And Jake? The boy who promised to be by her side, who swore to love her. The pain he felt soon turned into an intense rage. She knew she couldn't just let this go. The betrayal was too great to ignore. After seeing Jake leaving the room, and soon after, his mother, Emma decided that that night would be the end of everything. They had to pay for what they did. Emma drove back home, her hands shaking on the steering wheel as her mind came up with a plan. She knew she needed to confront them, but she also knew it needed to be done right. I wanted them both to feel the same pain he was feeling, to know that their dirty secrets had been discovered. That night, Emma waited until her father went to sleep. She knew the confrontation should be private, something between her, her mother, and Jake. When the house was silent, she sent a message to Jake, pretending to be his mother. "We need to talk. Come here at 11 p.m. Jake, without suspecting anything, accepted the invitation. When the clock struck 11 p.m., Emma hid in the living room, waiting for him to arrive. Susan, who was in the room, had no idea what was about to happen. When Jake entered the back door, he found Emma there, waiting for him, the expression of pain and anger clearly visible on her face. The surprise was so great that Jake had no reaction, but before he could say anything, Emma confronted him. The room that had previously been a haven of tranquility was now the scene of an explosion of screams, accusations, and tears. Emma vented everything she was feeling, and Jake, terrified, tried to justify himself. But words weren't enough to erase what he had done. Susan went downstairs, attracted by the noise, and upon seeing the scene, realized that the secret had been revealed. She tried to calm her daughter, but nothing she said could lessen the hatred Emma felt. The betrayal was unbearable, and the night, which began with a discovery, would end in a way no one could have imagined. At that moment, the mask fell, and the Thompson family was destroyed from the inside out. The words spoken that night could never be taken back, and the path to the tragic outcome was already paved. The discovery was not the end, but just the beginning of a nightmare that Springfield would never forget. Michael, awakened by the screams, went downstairs and found his family in the midst of an explosion of accusations. Susan was crying, begging for her daughter's forgiveness, while Jake, pale and shaking, tried to explain the inexplicable. Emma, however, was beside herself, consumed by a mixture of anger and pain that obscured any trace of rationality. Michael tried to understand what was happening, but Emma's words were like knives cutting through the air. His wife's betrayal and Jake's involvement, someone he considered part of the family, was difficult information to process. He felt his world crumble in a matter of seconds. The family he had worked so hard to build was being destroyed right before his eyes. As Michael tried to calm Emma, something inside her broke for good. The fury she had been suppressing manifested itself in a way that not even she knew she was capable of. Without thinking twice, Emma ran into the kitchen and grabbed the first thing she found, a knife. Her thoughts were clouded, driven by the desire to end the pain that consumed her. Jake, seeing the knife in Emma's hand, took a step back in alarm. "Emma, don't do this," he begged, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. At that moment, Emma was no longer the girl he knew. She was a force of vengeance, determined to bring an end to the man who had so brutally betrayed her trust. Michael, realizing what was about to happen, tried to intervene, but it was too late. In a quick, desperate movement, Emma lunged at Jake. The knife found its target with a dull thud, slicing through the flesh with an ease that surprised her. Jake screamed in pain, a sound that echoed through the house, but Emma didn't stop. The anger she felt was so overwhelming that it completely controlled her. Susan, horrified, tried to push her daughter away, but was pushed aside. Michael also tried to intervene, but shock and disbelief paralyzed him for a crucial moment. Everything happened so fast that it seemed unreal, as if they were living a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. Jake fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. His eyes, which were once shining with self-confidence, were now filled with fear and pain. He tried to speak, but his words were choked by the blood filling his mouth. Emma, still in a trance-like state, stood over him, the blood-stained knife in her trembling hand. It was only when Susan let out a desperate scream that Emma seemed to wake up from her state of fury. She looked at Jake's body on the floor, at the blood covering his hands, and the reality of what she had done hit her full force. Suddenly, hatred gave way to horror and regret. She dropped the knife, which clattered to the floor, and took a few steps back, shaking and in shock. Michael ran to Jake, trying desperately to stop the bleeding, but it was clear there was nothing he could do. Jake was dying, and everyone in the room knew it. The air was thick with the smell of blood and desperation, and the agonized sound of Jake's breathing was the only noise that filled the dead silence that settled in the house. Susan fell to her knees beside the body, tears streaming down her face as she stammered out disjointed words of regret and guilt. Emma stood there, motionless, watching the scene as if outside of her own body, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Jake died a few minutes later, his eyes fixed on a distant point, lifeless. Michael, still trying to understand what had just occurred, finally stood up, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked at Emma, his daughter, who seemed to be in shock, and then at Susan, who was breaking down emotionally next to Jake's body. Nobody said a word. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the realization that nothing would ever be the same. The Thompson family had been destroyed, not only by the forbidden affair, but also by the violence that followed. What began as a sordid secret ended in a tragedy no one could have predicted. The police arrived a few minutes later, called by neighbors who heard the screams and noise of the fight. When officers entered the home, they found the scene of a horrific crime. Jake lay dead on the living room floor, covered in blood, while Susan and Emma stood next to the body, both in shock. Michael, still trying to process what had happened, was the only one to speak to the police, explaining in fragments what had unfolded that night. Emma was taken into custody, still in a daze. She knew her life was ruined, that the pain and betrayal she felt had brought her to the point of no return. As she was led away by the police, her mind clung to a single truth. The forbidden secret had been discovered, but the price for that revelation was the total destruction of everything she knew and loved. The Thompson family tragedy would long be remembered in Springfield. A story of betrayal, revenge, and murder that would shock the community and serve as a dark reminder of how secrets can destroy lives in unimaginable ways. The weeks after the crime were marked by a mix of shock, sadness, and fury in Springfield. The Thompson case became the talk of the town. Local and national media covered every detail of the brutal murder. The case involving betrayal, forbidden secrets, and a shocking act of revenge. The small town, which was previously known for its tranquility, was transformed into a stage for unanswered questions and inquisitive looks. Emma was in prison, awaiting trial. The justice system was quick to bring charges: second-degree murder. Her defense attorney, however, attempted to argue that she had acted in a state of extreme emotional distress, attempting to mitigate the severity of her punishment. In court, a portrait of an emotionally destroyed young woman began to emerge, painting a picture of someone driven to the limit by an unbearable betrayal. However, the case was not that simple. Society was not willing to easily forgive what many considered a premeditated act. Jake, despite his betrayal, was also a tragic victim, and his family demanded justice. Tensions were palpable at each court session. Emma's trial divided public opinion, with some defending her pain and human reactions, while others called for severe punishment, claiming that nothing justified the brutality of the crime. Michael and Susan were trying to survive the wreckage of their lives. Their marriage, which was already seriously compromised, completely imploded. Susan, consumed by guilt and shame, moved to another city after filing for divorce. Unable to face judgment or the gaze of her neighbors, she disappeared from the headlines and the neighborhood, carrying with her the fragments of a life that would never be the same. The betrayal, for her, had a cost far beyond what she could have imagined. Michael, on the other hand, remained in Springfield. He refused to leave the city, even though every corner reminded him of what had happened. His attempts to rebuild his life were fragile, and he threw himself into work, trying to escape the pain that constantly haunted him. But the memories of that night never left him. The sound of the knife piercing Jake, the look of horror in Emma's eyes as she realized what she had done. These images tormented him. He visited Emma in prison from time to time, but the meetings were brief and filled with silence. Father and daughter, once so close, now seemed like strangers in a sea of guilt and regret. During the trial, Emma remained distant, almost absent. Her expression was blank, as if she was just existing in a state of suspension. Even after months in prison, she still struggled to accept what she had done. Remorse slowly ate away at her, and the loneliness in her cell seemed like a reflection of her own mind. She knew her life was ruined. Michael's visits were a mix of comfort and pain, but shame prevented her from facing him directly. The trial dragged on for months, with each witness recalling the details of the case, reliving the tragedy over and over for the public. Finally, the verdict was given. Emma was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge, although touched by Emma's emotional state and the factors that led to the crime, made it clear that she needed to be held accountable for Jake's murder. The sentence brought some relief to some parties, but the pain remained vivid, inescapable for everyone involved. The following years were tough. Emma spent most of her days in a cold cell, reflecting on what could have been different. The isolation only amplified her thoughts, making her relive that fateful day over and over in her mind. His youth, once full of possibilities, had turned into a literal and figurative prison. Her dreams of the future were dead along with Jake, and all that was left was regret. For Springfield, the Thompson case stood out as a symbol of how secrets and lies can escalate to the point of total destruction. The story of a mother who betrayed her daughter's trust, a man who succumbed to forbidden desire, and a young woman who failed to control her emotions at a critical moment served as a grim reminder. Emma Thompson's name would echo for years to come, a warning about the devastating consequences of unbridled anger and hatred. Michael continued his life as best he could, but loss followed him every step of the way. He traveled from time to time to visit Emma, but the void between them was never filled. He forgave her, but forgiving himself was a battle he had yet to win. And so, the Thompson family tragedy, marked by the horrific crime that happened that night, left deep scars on everyone involved. A story of secrets, betrayal, and revenge that could never be erased, etched into the history of Springfield as a terrifying example of how far human beings can go when pushed to the limit.